I can't say how long the weaver had been working before I finally noticed the signs. Sometimes I wonder if everything could have turned out differently if I had caught it earlier, paid closer attention, or made better choices. Maybe I could have stopped what was coming, or maybe it was already too late long before I realized anything was wrong. I'll never know, but that question has haunted me ever since. I'm a tailor, running a tiny shop tucked away beside a quiet pedestrian street. The place is much smaller than it looks from the outside. I was told it used to be an old laundromat before I rented it. Somehow, the building is packed with narrow rooms hidden behind oddly placed doors. Most of them are barely larger than storage closets, but they serve me well. A tailor can never have too much space for bolts of fabric, thread, buttons, and every little tool the job requires. People don't realize how quickly a tailoring shop fills with things: fabric scraps, measuring tapes, patterns, boxes of supplies. They multiply before you know it. No matter how organized you try to be, something always disappears. Something ends up somewhere it shouldn't, and something else goes missing entirely. Eventually you stop fighting the mess. If you don't learn to live with it, the clutter will slowly drive you insane. The first thing that truly bothered me was the mannequins. Not because they looked strange, but because they never stayed where I left them. At first I barely noticed. One would be standing a little closer to the window, another would somehow be facing a different direction. The changes were so subtle that I kept convincing myself I was simply remembering things wrong. But over time, the movements became impossible to ignore. Every morning, and sometimes even after stepping away for only a few minutes, they were standing somewhere new. Of course, I wasn't stupid enough to think they were walking around by themselves. To prove it, I drew chalk outlines around each mannequin's feet before leaving the room. When I returned, none of them were standing inside the marks anymore. Every single one had been moved. I immediately assumed Olivia was responsible. She worked with me every day, and although I couldn't understand why she'd waste time playing such a bizarre prank, it seemed like the only reasonable explanation. I wasn't exactly known for understanding jokes. Usually I just waited until someone explained the punchline. Whether Olivia admitted it or not didn't really matter. As far as I was concerned, someone was moving the mannequins, and at least I knew I wasn't imagining it. Then there was the sound. A quiet, rhythmic clatter echoed through the shop from time to time. It reminded me of an old weaving loom, the steady clicking of the shuttle gliding back and forth across the threads. It definitely wasn't mine. I kept an antique loom in the shop mostly as decoration. Neither Olivia nor I had touched it in well over a year, and I could clearly see it sitting motionless a couple of rooms away whenever the noise appeared. Thinking back, I realized I'd been hearing that strange rhythm for weeks, maybe even months. I'd always brushed it off as distant traffic, or sounds coming from one of the neighboring stores. But once I recognized what it actually sounded like, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Out of curiosity, I walked over to my loom and slid the shuttle back and forth a few times. The sound was identical, exactly the same, but the moment I stepped away, the mysterious clacking stopped. It was almost as if my loom had interrupted whatever had been making the noise by perfectly imitating it. I returned to the main workroom. Every mannequin had changed position again. This time, each one stood with its head tilted unnaturally backward, their blank faces fixed on something above them. Even the headless display forms leaned sharply in the same direction, as though they too were trying to stare at whatever hung overhead. Against my better judgment, I looked up. There was nothing there, just the ceiling. At that moment, Olivia stepped into the room. "See something up there?" she asked. "Have you been moving the mannequins?" I replied. She shrugged. "Of course, I move them whenever I need one." But, she paused, glancing around the room. "I definitely didn't line them all up to face the front door. That seems like a great way to scare off customers." I slowly lowered my eyes. She was right. Every mannequin had turned toward the entrance. Those with arms had lifted one, or sometimes both, as if silently pointing at whoever would walk through the door next. It almost looked like they were preparing to accuse someone of a terrible crime. The display was deeply unsettling. "Help me move them back," I said. As I reached for the nearest mannequin, I braced myself. I expected the plastic body to feel strangely warm. I expected to feel a heartbeat beneath its hollow chest. I expected stiff fingers to suddenly wrap around my wrist. None of it happened. It was just a mannequin, cold, heavy, lifeless. It slid across the floor exactly as it always had. Olivia had no trouble moving the others either, and before long we had all 12, lying neatly against the wall once more. "Why do you even own so many of these?" Olivia asked as she dusted off her hands. I counted them, exactly 12. Most were dressed in unfinished garments waiting for alterations. A few wore completed outfits simply because they looked good on display. 2 stood completely naked, smooth plastic catching the afternoon light. I'd collected them one by one over the years. A tailor's shop felt incomplete without mannequins. They were practical for fittings, but they also created the impression that work was always happening, even when the shop happened to be quiet. Still, something felt wrong. I could have sworn there used to be more than 12. The missing ones were probably tucked away somewhere. This shop was practically a maze, packed with tiny storage rooms and forgotten corners. It wouldn't be unusual for 1 or 2 mannequins to end up hidden behind shelves of fabric or boxes of supplies. Even if they had somehow been moved, they couldn't have gone far, could they? For a moment I wondered if Olivia had simply stored a few elsewhere, but she'd already said she hadn't. Maybe I was just remembering incorrectly. Things vanished around this shop all the time. That was nothing new. It was one reason I was always extra careful with customers' clothing. Losing someone's suit or wedding dress would be impossible to explain, especially when I often couldn't explain where my own supplies had disappeared to. Then I heard it again. Click, clack, click, clack. The steady rhythm of a weaving loom echoed faintly through the building. I walked toward the nearest wall and pressed my ear against it. The sound immediately became louder, much louder. It seemed to be coming from the room on the opposite side of the wall, except that room didn't contain a loom. Even so, I stepped inside the room. Nothing seemed unusual. Scraps of fabric lay scattered across the floor, while bolts of cloth crowded the shelves lining the walls. The strange clacking had faded, but as soon as I pressed my ear against the same wall again, it returned. Louder. It sounded as though the loom was working only inches away, which made no sense. Moments earlier, I had been standing on the opposite side of that very wall, hearing the exact same thing. I placed both palms against it, one hand on each side. The 2 surfaces were separated by only a few inches of plaster. There was simply no space inside that wall for a loom. "What are you doing?" Olivia's voice came from directly behind me. I hadn't heard her approach. She moved with the same eerie silence as the mannequins. "Do you hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" "It sounds like..." I stopped. The clacking had vanished again. I pressed my ear against both sides of the wall. Silence.